Tell me.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. Welcome, everybody, to the Next Economy Dialogues. The Lyft Economy team, Ryan and I decided that looking at the conversations and the questions that we get, whether we're doing the Next Economy MBA training or working with our clients or doing our field building, there's a number of topics that come up that we don't really have space for sharing. And it seems like there's a lot of interest in taking a Next Economy context and going deeper. So consider these like informal deep dive conversations, and we're just kicking it off and seeing how it's going to go. What I'd encourage is, if you like what we're talking about, or especially if you have questions or concerns about anything really that intersects with the next economy, and you're curious for our thoughts based on what we're seeing or what questions we're asking, go ahead and put it into the comments on YouTube here. And we're going to start using our YouTube channel more to actually solicit kind of the content, some of which might end up in the Next Economy MBA training, but all of which will end up on the Lyft YouTube channel. Is that right, Ryan? Did I miss anything?
That sounds good. And I just think that one great way to stay in touch with everything we're up to is through the Lyft newsletter. So if folks haven't already, you can go to bit.ly/Lyft newsletter, LIFT newsletter or not any dot at the end. So bit.ly/Lyft newsletter. And that's the best way to stay up to date with us.
Great. And that comes out monthly with, sometimes there's special announcements when there's very timely content in addition to that.
Yeah. I mean, it's also worth noting that we have a podcast, Next Economy Now, which is on iTunes and Overcast and Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. But this is what we originally wanted to do with the podcast, Kevin, if you remember, is we had been talking amongst the Lyft team about what topics were we really interested about.
Right.
Were we really interested in that we weren't necessarily getting a chance to talk about in other parts of our life? So we started recording conversations about things like why are worker cooperatives important, or what is value-based invoicing, what is an appropriate rate of return for the next economy investor. And we kind of, the podcast kind of took on a life of its own as more of a interview format with next economy leaders. So
yeah, really sharing the stories of what we're seeing out there, things that are working, that are just not as well heard as we think they deserve to be, in helping inspire action towards helping co-create this next economy.
Yeah. And so maybe this is a way to get back to the informal freewheeling discussions that we originally intended. Yeah. So what's on your mind, Kevin? What are you most excited about these days?
Gosh, so many things. One that keeps on coming up during our next MBA training, and just with everybody going to Burning Man this week. So many of the burners. There's so much excitement around either blockchain, decentralized ledger, or one of the use cases of blockchain, the cryptocurrency world. I mean, have you been hearing about that too, Ryan? And how that intersects with the next economy?
Yeah, I mean, you were one of the first people, I think on our first episode of Next Economy Now, I had asked you about cryptocurrency and is Bitcoin really helping or hurting? And you had told me about Faircoin and some other ones, but you had some interesting insights that I don't think many people understand about crypto. And is it actually benefiting? Is it actually creating benefit for all?
And I think that's the question, right? Both to distinguish some terms, I think it's helpful to disambiguate cryptocurrency from blockchain, and even to disambiguate blockchain as a form of decentralized ledger, ideally incorruptible, or as little chance of corruption as possible in terms of a public accounting or a public ledger. And those,
maybe it's useful just to define terms like,
I could do my best. I often defer to others who take a lot of time and energy to understand this space. Essentially, working our way back from the end there, decentralized ledger, this idea that there's some type of technology that enables for decentralized settlement or a public accounting of something that actually happened in the world that is replicated and verified not by a centralized authority or place, but in a decentralized fashion. Meaning that if somebody were to corrupt it or change something, they'd have to change it everywhere all at once, which is maybe less plausible or even impossible. And I think that's one of the breakthrough technologies, is having this idea of a decentralized ledger. Now, some of the work that's being done right now is to reduce the transaction costs, energetic costs of that type of verification in a decentralized way, and the mechanisms of verification. Blockchain is an instantiation of decentralized ledger, a specific technology that has mechanisms for creating that public ledger in a decentralized way. Bitcoin is an example of a cryptocurrency that uses blockchain as the underlying technology. So you could say Bitcoin is a use case of, and many cryptocurrencies become a use case of blockchain.
And I think it's important for people just to know that, like in the past, it's been a bank is your trusted single point of saying, if I want to pay Kevin $100, I transfer it from my bank to his bank, and we trust the banks as institutions to verify that that transaction happened. The banks take a fee. We know the banks aren't always that trustworthy. And so a decentralized ledger is a way to say, how can I transfer $100 to Kevin and by an entire network of computers verifying that, you can start to remove the sort of hold of banks being the only ones to transfer money to each other. Is that kind of right?
In the case of currency, and if you take decentralized ledger and think about it that way, and I think that's a really good insight, Ryan, is just take any intermediary. So who verifies that something actually happened, a contract, take in the quasi quote unquote sharing economy, take Airbnb or Lyft or Uber or any of these intermediaries where somebody provides a service, somebody utilizes the service, there's some type of settlement and transaction, and then these intermediaries take a percentage of that transaction, which some people would say is exploitative, depending on how onerous the percentage of the transaction is. And so the potential of a decentralized ledger is essentially to break down intermediaries and make for a more peer-to-peer world where you could have transactions without the overhead and the exploitation that commonly comes with intermediaries, which is really exciting and fraught with, I think, some challenges to get from here to there. And that's, I think, some of the work of our time. So is cryptocurrency, to your original question, is cryptocurrency, is blockchain, is decentralized ledger being a benefit to life, to all people? Well, if you take some of the early use cases, say Bitcoin, kind of decidedly not. Bitcoin shows up as concentrating wealth into very few hands. If you look at kind of the ownership of Bitcoin and the speculation within that cryptocurrency, I don't know that yet that Bitcoin as a use case of decentralized ledger or blockchain in particular has created a massive amount of benefit. This idea of reducing transaction costs and breaking down intermediaries and allowing for decentralized exchange and peer-to-peer exchange, there could be potentially massive benefit to humanity, especially if you get to the point where exchange can be regularly mediated by a currency that could be designed with, anti-speculation design rules that made it more, say, controllable, as well as if you had scarcity built out of it, you could introduce things like demurrage or at least no interest on the creation of currency, even if it has a debt component to it. So there's a lot that can potentially be done.
Has been, you have assets that slowly decline in value if they're not used. Is that what?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So if you don't keep a certain volume of transaction going, then the actual value of the asset, which all things in life do that, right? It's an odd thing that you could buy an asset, a home or something like that, and actually have it accrete in value without having to add value to it or maintain it because of speculation. And currency is like that as well. There's almost nothing in natural systems that does that. There are certain things that add value over time, but in the long run they decay. And so that's something that, imagine if we could design our currencies to be in alignment with kind of the natural world. And so that potential, I think that's why we get excited around blockchain or decentralized ledger in general, is there's a lot of potential for eliminating intermediaries. The risk right now that I see is that most of the work of the technology development that's designing how these systems work is being financed through the business as usual kind of world of venture capital. And so that world prioritizes outsized returns, rapid growth, short-term exits, quick liquidity. And so there's a lot of pressure and drivers on the actual technology development to bake in or utilize the business as usual scarcity paradigms. And so that, I think, has a lot of risk of compromising the potential. And you see that the most exciting, where people get super excited right now about Bitcoin or cryptocurrency in general, is the opportunity to get rich quick and not have to put in a lot of effort, if you will, or work to get rich quick, which I think is that follows the tropes and norms of the business as usual economy. If we ask the question, how can we use the same technologies to actually benefit all life? I think there's some exciting possibilities there. And there are people asking those questions. It's just it's the definite minority of the world of people working on cryptocurrency and blockchain and decentralized ledger.
Can you just describe maybe on cryptocurrency and then moving to maybe some blockchain or other examples, how does Faircoin or some of these other more fair cryptocurrencies address the scarcity and speculation problem?
Well, I mean, I think, again, I'd probably defer to Faircoin and Holochain, who have fairly good descriptions of what makes them distinct in terms of the way in which they're designing either their ledger or their accounting system or their instantiation as a cryptocurrency, in the case of Faircoin, in terms of what makes them different and distinct from, say, Bitcoin. But in general, there are ways to build in anti-speculation provisions into the design of the currency. And there are potentially ways to avoid scarcity. So depending on the governance of the cryptocurrency, which right now is one of the opportunities of decentralized ledger, but the governance becomes the key piece, the key differentiator. And I guess in the resources, I keep a list of resources of which I'm tracking. It's kind of like tracking the field. At Lift Economy, I don't know, Ryan, correct me, I don't know if any members of our team are actually working, I guess maybe one member, but are working on any projects related to the space of decentralized ledger or cryptocurrency, where I feel like we're more like tracking, just watching what's happening and looking for signals for those who are working on things that are authentically working for the benefit of all life. My litmus test is, if you present to me a decentralized ledger project or a blockchain project or a crypto project, and I can say, it's a flippant kind of litmus test, but as long as nobody's getting rich, there's going to be nobody in this endeavor who becomes a millionaire, something like that. That's my litmus test. And so far, very few projects have kind of passed that, just even basic sniff test. the allure of hyper accumulation of wealth, I think it becomes the main driver for a lot of the projects. I don't know Faircoin well enough to be able to say whether it passes the litmus test or not. And I know some of the principals working on the holochain work, and historically, based on their ethics and what they've worked on in the past, it seems like a good signals. But again, I'm kind of more in loose tracking mode. I mean, have you seen anything that inspires you?
Well, I mean, one thing that you said that could be interesting to readers is, do you have this? Are you willing to share this resource list, or what are you tracking, and can folks see kind of what interests? Is this on the Lift vision articulation? Is that what you're talking about? Or?
No, but I have a tracking sheet, just my own notes for, like, we haven't decided that blockchain, decentralized ledger, crypto world is something that we'll do any field building around with regards to Next Economy right now. But I have a preliminary tracking sheet. Every one of the field building work that we've done at Lift Economy has kind of started with an assessment tracking sheet, what's going on out there. I mean, the most exciting project that we know of that's utilizing this technology really is focused on governance, and our friends and allies at Terragenesis and their work. That's probably the number one project that we're tracking. That is very interesting. There's a couple others.
What is that project, the Terragenesis one?
I'm a bit embarrassed because I'm forgetting its name right now, but I will look it up right now.
Live and uncut.
Yeah. Are you? I mean, so you're not tracking much on that in that space, are you?
I guess I track the speculation in Bitcoin and the sort of interest that venture capitalists seem to have in it, and the faith that many Silicon Valley type folks put in Bitcoin changing the world. But I too am starting to see more cases of decentralized ledger or the blockchain be applied to different challenges. So I think I've heard some folks say, and I can't remember if this was you, but it seems like the main outcome or the main benefit of this awareness in cryptocurrency could be that the decentralized ledger and blockchain technology could be used widely for benefit. And so I think that one thing that's going to be interesting is how does, not necessarily as a currency it could be, but how does it apply to various situations? So have you seen, are there any blockchain specific applications that are Next Economy-ish that are not necessarily tied to currency?
Well, so, and forgive me for being super, and maybe I am a bit embarrassed, but Terragenesis project is called Regen Network. And that's a whole kind of collaboration that started with the Terragenesis team. And Regen Network looks at, kind of broadly speaking, there's a potential use case in terms of blockchain or decentralized ledger that I think is worthy of getting excited about, which is the possibility that there's a problem with the carbon markets. So the big picture is you have, from the Paris Accord and IPCC, of countries, states, governments all over the world that have acknowledged that they need to invest in practices, land use practices, agricultural practices, in addition to diversified renewable energy and energy efficiency stuff, to both reduce in the carbon in the atmosphere, or carbon equivalents in the atmosphere, greenhouse gases, as well as to sequester greenhouse gases into above ground biomass, trees, plants, as well as soils. And so theoretically, there should be a lot more money and resources going into specifically creating outcomes related to carbon sequestration or carbon reduction. And that's probably true, right? There's going to be a lot more money. And one of the barriers, why isn't there a lot of money pouring into it now? One barrier that is both real and perceived is that, how do you verify that the outcome that you're intending to create with, say, carbon sequestration in soils or above ground biomass, how do you verify that that actually happened? And if you remember from just decentralized ledger in the abstract, decentralized ledger is its kind of primary use case is to be able to verify that something actually happened at low transaction cost, or without an intermediary that's corruptible. And that could be theoretically very important for creating less friction in carbon markets. I think it's probably one of the barriers of carbon markets actually seeing more money, seeing more transactions in carbon markets be one of the barriers. I don't know if it's the barrier. And Regen Network, you can read their white paper on their website, is probably, I would say, probably the thought leader that I'm tracking in terms of thinking about the governance of how verification happens for these types of outcomes, and making sure that there's, again, this public accountability through a ledger system. And they're focused on that. There's another group called Nori, for example, which is working on the settlement piece of those transactions to make those markets more fluid. And I think those are interesting efforts. I'm not yet convinced that those are the capital T, the barriers to carbon markets, but I think they play a role, and I think it's really important. And there's a few others along those same lines. So that could be an interesting use case. I mean, a big other bucket of use cases for a decentralized ledger would be the disintermediation, is that a word, of the sharing economy as it's manifested. So the hypervaluations of Airbnb and Uber and Lyft and these types of things. These intermediaries, I think, with open source and available decentralized ledger blockchain technology, there's the possibility that communities, rather than hypervalued companies, could actually develop essentially platform cooperatives that leverage that technology to reduce the transaction costs and reduce the friction of enabling some of these peer-to-peer transactions. And if platform cooperatives could theoretically displace the Airbnbs and Ubers of the world, where you could have a more decentralized peer-to-peer, and that could be very important for humanity if you take all the possible cooperatives that could develop for peer-to-peer, when we're able to help each other meet our needs. That's without having these intermediaries. There's less leakage and more local self-reliance that's possible. So that could become the cornerstone of an economy that works for the benefit of all life. And so I think there's a huge potential there that's exciting as a use case.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think you had asked earlier, why is Lyft currently working on any projects related to blockchain or cryptocurrency or decentralized ledger? And I think, I'd be curious what your answer is to this, but I think the reason we're not is because we often see that a technology solution, there's often sort of baseline needs in a business around vision, culture, strategy, operation, or just racial justice, white privilege, that if it's not addressed in the base form, it gets amplified in technology. So like technology can be amplified for good, or it can just sort of amplify our own. So it seems to me that Lyft economy has been focused more on like, what are these fundamental systems and trying to shore those up, rather than sort of chasing AI or drones, or like how can drones fly over and plant like 1 billion seeds that are, and grow food for millions of people. Like, we know some people who are into that, Google X, but it's not our. Is that your analysis of why we're not necessarily focusing on those things?
Yes, and we do know of a lot of different projects that are focused on the use of technology for the benefit of life, and I think those are important to track. And I think there's a number of potential use cases where technology could act in service as a tool. And I think what you're talking about, Ryan, is sometimes when we romanticize the outcomes that technology can produce, because it's producing so many amazing outcomes for the affluent world and people's lives. Amazing meaning very impactful in terms of people's day-to-day behaviors and habits. Technology has a huge role, and it's moving very fast. There's a lot of change and dynamism in people's lives related to their interactions with technology, especially in the affluent world where technology is accessible. And that's something that makes it sometimes gets conflated. Is technology a tool or is it the thing? And I would say that that's the distinction. If technology is in its right place as a tool from a solid foundation, an ethical foundation, ethical framework, a principled framework for what's the purpose of the tool, what's the outcome that you want to create? Is it to create outsized financial returns for wealth holders that are existing wealth holders? Well, if that's the outcome, then that would be somewhat antithetical or directly antithetical towards the outcomes that we're looking for in the next economy. And there might be a number of potential. Sometimes we could talk about hospice. Those of you taking the Next Economy MBA know we talk about that kind of hospicing out. There's a lot of things that could be done less bad that might result in some returns for some of the business as usual structures temporarily for a period of time. Ultimately, we want to see the distribution of wealth and different ways of measuring it to everybody so that nobody's left out of participating in the endeavor for humanity to meet its needs. So I think technology has a really incredible role. And I see sometimes it's so exciting or distracting for some people that it takes on the primary role. It's no longer a tool, it's the thing. And that's, so yeah, I think Lift Economy definitely works with projects that partner with technology as a tool. And I'm pretty excited by those, whether it's, potential ways to create more planting of vegetation, trees with drones. Those are pretty exciting potential use cases. But I think coming from the point of how does that tool fit within the next economy so that it's actually creating benefit for everybody with no one left out, those are great questions I think to start with. And that's the questions that we start with.
Since we're freewheeling a bit here, how do you feel about, it seems like a lot of questions go back to the economy. So there's capitalism that most of the world seems to be involved in. And then there are some states that are quote unquote communist, like China or others, where it's debatable how communist they are, but it seems like you're either capitalist and you're trying to make money at the sort of by nature, there's winners and losers in capitalism, or you're in communism and you're sort of everything is trying to be equal all the time, and whether or not that actually works. What do you see does capitalism as a system need to go away, or is it just modifying it slightly? Or I'm actually I don't know if we've ever gotten into this in our freewheeling discussions around is capitalism as a system in the 500-year vision for the next economy, is it part of that, or is it something else? I don't know if I've ever asked you that question. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. And you can see in the discourse of the next economy, we tend to avoid discussing isms, communism, capitalism, mainly because in our experience of all the trainings we've done and work with clients even, there's typically not a consensual understanding of those terms. If I took 10 people and said, what is your definition of capitalism? In my experience, I don't get nearly, I get some alignment, but very little, a lot of divergence in terms of how people are defining it. Even the way you described it now, I might, we could pick it apart and like kind of dissect how we're defining the terms. And then once we arrive at some consensus, then we might find pathways through. I don't know if that's our role. I would defer to Noam Chomsky or Murray Bookchin's or so many other great thinkers and writers who have done more of the rigorous work on defining those terms. An example I think Noam Chomsky frequently brings up is, I don't know if you could describe the US system as really capitalism. There's a tremendous amount of state subsidy. You look at the world of agriculture, technology, in terms of the defense spending as like take any of the big technology companies now, none of them would exist without the state spending. So this idea of a free market outside of the state kind of influence of capitalism doesn't really exist. And then the communism of, say, China today, I would say is more like state capitalism. It's where the state plays a bigger role than it does here, but neither of them are really capitalism. Neither of them are pure communism or pure capitalism. And so I don't know that those terms are actually that useful towards the discourse about what it is we want. So we take the position on Next Economy is to focus on what is it that we want. What do we want? That's before getting into isms. We want a world where everybody has their needs met. Everybody has adequate food. Everybody has adequate water, sanitation. Everybody has a home if they want it, and comfort. Doing so while actually increasing biodiversity, or at least enhancing the environment around us. So if you start with that, what do you call that? What's the system that gets us there? Is there an ism that creates those outcomes? So focusing on those outcomes. Again, we could argue, is it individual socialism, anarcho-syndicalism, anarchism? There's so many isms to rigorously parse through and try and get shared definition. And in general, I don't find that type of discussion really that useful. I'm sure defining terms is useful on some level. Shared language creates opportunities for shared strategies. What I find enrolls more people right now is to focus on the strategies, actually the work and taking action. I think the exciting thing for me is that if you take the basic premise, what is the next economy, one that works for the benefit of all life with no one left out, there are people who are working on that. There are projects all over the world that are either trending towards that or are doggedly determined to create those outcomes. And they're actually working. They're just very piecemeal. There's one over here, one over there. They're very fractured, decentralized, spread out. And I get excited by that because I think the next economy, when we say next economy now, it's that it's actually happening. It's just not yet the mainstream ways of meeting needs. And I think there's so many distractions. If I said, do you want to live in a world where there's 800 million people who are hungry tomorrow or today? I don't know anybody really who would say, yeah, that's the world I want to live in. Maybe if they're distracted or confused.
Defer to they would start to say what's causing it, their opinion of the problem.
Sure. Yeah. Their analysis of
it's the Republicans, it's the Democrats.
Right. Their analysis of why it's happening might be vastly different. But I don't know anybody who really wants that to be the condition. And our posit is, if you define economy very broadly, not as capitalism and not as communism, not as state socialism, not as anarchism. If you define the economy broadly as the way in which humans collectively meet our needs to take care of our home, or the oikos, the economy, taking care of our home, the earth, or all of us. If you define the economy broadly enough, I think you could come to the conclusion with the cursory analysis that it's not working. Whether it's capital, whatever ism you want to apply to it, I don't think it's working. There are a lot of people suffering right now on Earth. The environment, every major ecosystem is in rapid decline, according to the Millennium Assessment in 2005 by the UN, and the IPCC look at climate change, existential crisis. So I would argue it's pretty simple to assess that the economy is not working. It's not. And so what would it look like if it were working is like the basic premise to start designing towards that. And maybe we leverage some of the tropes and norms that are associated with capitalism along the way, and maybe some of the idealized, romanticized potentials of a communist kind of economy fit in there. I don't know that it's important to go with an ism. I think it's looking at what's actually happening on the ground and seeing how the system could transform over time to one that works. And then we could decide. I mean, I'm not attached to whatever it's called. I don't really care what it's called, as long as it's working.
Are there any systems that examples of the, I know we had talked about like eco villages that you've looked at in the past, or like, are there any, everyone, in the US, we often say like, oh, the Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Sweden, but are there other examples of communities or projects that are working very well?
Well, I mean, there's both today and then historically. Those are good questions and worth talking about. And again, I think of like the work of Noam Chomsky. He gets asked this question. He's a major critic of what's going on, and really erudite, like super intelligent. And he'll get asked this question, like, when did it ever work? And he'll point to the Spanish Revolution, 20th century, and he'll point to sometimes the kibbutzim in Israel, these ideas of fairly decentralized, you could say anarcho-syndicalist or syndicates of decentralized communities that take on their governance for themselves, essentially. So collective, communitarian in nature. And I'm reading a book by John Curl. Oh shoot, that's the name. It's what's called For All the People, kind of about the communitarian or cooperativism history in the United States. And I think history is littered with attempts and examples of communities and groups of people who have recognized that if we are more self-determined and take take a cooperative approach to meeting our needs, that we can be more effective in meeting everybody's needs, and there's a number of examples that have existed. That book is just again littered with examples. And there's other authors who have looked at indigenous communities and found examples. So there's a history. And where does it exist today? The eco-village movement in general is a good expression of those possibilities. And I think wherever you find existing indigenous communities, oftentimes you find more communitarian, cooperative endeavors. And what here in this country, I think if you're taking this kind of big frame approach and kind of almost the intellectual frameworks, the Next Systems Project is something that I draw a lot of inspiration from in terms of how they're thinking about what is the system if it's not capitalism, not communism, not state socialism, and it's maybe quasi-Scandinavian, or what does it potentially look like? And you kind of come to this idea that if you decentralize, that's where we talk about the bioregionally, locally self-reliant economy. So locally self-reliant doesn't mean locally self-sufficient. It's not like this provincial, there's no trade or exchange going around the world. Humanity has kind of come to this dawning awareness still of that there is one Earth. And I think exchange, cultural exchange, and even some material exchange around the globe is really valuable. But this idea that each region of the world provides as much as possible, as much as reasonable, its own food, its own water, its own sheltering systems, its own textiles, and this decentralization is, I think, the potential. So communities in place meeting as much of their own needs as possible or as reasonable, while exchanging the things that are beautiful to exchange kind of around the world. That locally self-reliant economy, I don't know, again, what you call it, but that's, and again, the eco villages are in some cases are trying to take that on. If we can re-village and have a village that's as self-reliant as possible, we can demonstrate, I think, to the world that we can live in ways that actually are enhancing or even beneficial to the environment, as well as meeting everybody's needs. I think those are really courageous efforts, and they run so orthogonal. They run so contrary to the norms of the business as usual economy, especially in the affluent world. Well, I guess all over the world, and it's very challenging. They're really culturally invisible, those efforts, because there's so many constraints to enable those, and consequently, a lot of eco-village living is perceived as psychologically inaccessible to people. They're like, oh gosh, I have to go live in a village or something like that. What does it mean? Does it mean I can't drive? I have to give my car, or there's no more money, or there's so many, I think, fears around what it would mean to live in a locally self-reliant economy, because it's so contrary from how people were raised in the affluent world. And yet it's so close at home to those who are raised in a more indigenous kind of context. I think that some of the great work of our time is to demonstrate that this type of transition to a more locally self-reliant economy is safe and comfortable and accessible. And that's definitely tricky territory. But that's and language, I'm sure, plays a larger role than I'm maybe giving it in terms of what we call it and what ism it is and so forth. That it probably is more important than I think about. I'm curious what anybody who watches this and listens to this, I'm curious what you think, how important you think language is in this transition.
Yeah, I was going to say we should probably wrap here. But is there any requests to the audience, or where folks can learn more about what we're up to?
Yeah, well, I mean, this was a perfect example of what I think the next economy dialogues will look like. They'll be somewhat rambling, but the more we have topics that you're curious about, when we do have a list that people have sent us and things that come up in our client conversations that we could build off of. But to the extent that you have questions or comments that will help inform this discussion, I have a lot more to say about technology. I'm reflecting on the conversation we just had. I think that could be a whole other topic, something of how we see technology fitting into the next economy. Something I don't get to talk about much based on the types of companies we work with, and there are some very exciting possibilities. Whereas it's also true, I think, that most of the technology we need to get us to that next economy already exists. I think there is a bit of repackaging that needs to happen, and plenty of room for human ingenuity and innovation as well. So that's a topic that I'd love to pick up again. But my request would be, if there's anything that you want to hear from our observations or from case studies or who we're working with, let us know, and we'll pick those up in a conversation.
Yeah, so folks can post in the comments of this YouTube video, and we will review those before our next YouTube video. So it's probably the best way is just to comment here, say what you liked and didn't like, and we'll take that and carry it on to the next one. And again, if you're interested in learning more about Lift Economy, we're at www.lifteconomy.com, L-I-F-T economy.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next week.
All right, we'll see you again next week.